Hurst by Robin Crombie. Therefore wait for me, declares the Lord, for the day when I rise up as a witness. Indeed, my decision is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, to pour out on them my indignation, all my burning anger, for all the earth will be devoured by the fire of my zeal. Zephaniah, chapter 3, verse 8. Chapter 1. This was an ancient place, remote and desolate, peaceful, yet witness to centuries of warmongering, standing ready to do its duty, a never-ending vigil set to the rhythmic rise and fall of the ocean. It was only a matter of time before all this would be swept away. The castle's resolute defences were imperceptibly weakened by every breaking wave sweeping in from the channel, sent crashing against the groins and stones. A pale sun rose silently and unnoticed over Hurst Castle. Shadows stretching over the rippled tidal waters that all but surrounded it, bar a narrow finger of shingle linking the fortifications to the mainland. Hurst's 74 occupants were slumbering in their quarters. The more recent arrivals were camped out in the east wing, tents pitched where grass and space allowed. In the dorm room in the main building, a shaft of sunlight pierced the makeshift curtains. 2 grey blankets strung across the large stone window aperture prolonged the darkness. The shaft of light fell across the pillow of one of the iron-framed beds, bathing the unshaven face of a man in white light as he began to wake. Zed stretched and yawned, looking around at his companions. Packed tightly together, a sleeping mass of washed-up humanity snored gently. There was a low snuffle of someone stirring in the corner, heavy breathing, and the universal stench of unwashed bodies and morning breath. From outside came the low sound of waves breaking gently over the rocks and shingle spit. Seagulls soaring above the castle that spoke of a new morning, bringing with it new hope. For many, the sounds reminded them of former lives, holidays by the seaside, long-forgotten memories. A base need to breathe fresh air and enjoy the peace of the castle in the early dawn compelled Zed to take his morning constitutional walk. He was fond of rising before anyone else was up and having the place to himself. Stepping outside, he squinted, shading his eyes, taking a moment to bathe his face in the sunshine, inhaling deeply the sea air. His hair was unkempt and unwashed. Long sideburns grew down his cheeks and a tuft of hair stuck upright. He wore a grubby T-shirt with Wayland Corporation on the front, chest-high salt stains from wading in seawater to unload stores from a visiting fishing boat. He had the air of someone who looked after himself, a loner, a survivor with the scars to prove it. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy the company of others, he did, but when push came to shove, he had no time for the weak. Survive or die, get in his way and face the consequences. Leaving the castle keep and its cold grey stone walls, he meandered sleepily, still yawning, through the Tudor archway. Beyond the gate was a narrow strip of grass that stretched out for 100 metres or so to the western walls of the fort, extended in Victorian times. A large marquee dominated the interior. Half a dozen smaller tents were pitched haphazardly around it. Passing the canteen, he took the stairs 2 at a time. Up onto the raised walkway and ramparts, he looked southwest across the narrow channel, towards the Isle of Wight and the Needles Rocks. There was still a faint haze that shrouded the rocks in a light mist, slowly evaporating as the shadows shortened on the water. He unzipped his fly to pee over the battlements. Urine rained down onto some weeds that grew against the base of the crumbling brick wall, some 30 feet below. He scanned the horizon across the salt marshes towards Keyhaven. A pair of swans glided gracefully against the incoming tide within the sheltered estuary that lay behind a narrow shingle spit. As he turned to look back up the finger of land and the raised roadway on top of the shingle, the movement of a dark shape in the distance interrupted his gaze. The figure was limping awkwardly. A long, heavy coat, several sizes too big, was draped around his shoulders. On the castle walls, Zed reached for the pair of binoculars that lived in a large blue plastic IKEA storage box under the bench seat. He took a couple of seconds to find and focus on the figure in the distance. There was no question. What had first appeared as a limp was more severe in focus, the left leg dragging heavily on the shingle, scraping at each step. His progress was laboured, but he showed no sign of discomfort or pain as he approached. Zed lowered the binoculars and squinted back at the shape with his bare eyes. The hint of a smile appeared on his lips. He reached back into the blue container and brought out a hunting rifle. Loading a single bullet into the breech, he took careful aim at the figure in the distance. Adjusting his position a couple of times, he relaxed into a wide stance, the rifle resting on the edge of the brick wall. The crosshairs of the telescopic sight danced around the head of the approaching figure. It was still perhaps 200 meters away now, making steady progress. He regulated his breathing before exhaling deeply. The rifle shot rang out across Christchurch Bay, echoing around the battlements, shattering the silence of the early morning. A flock of birds rose startled from the salt marshes. In the fenced-off field next to the lighthouse, a herd of dairy cows started and bumped into each other, wild-eyed. The two horses bolted, one jumping over the low-wire fence and charging away from the noise. Its hooves clattered on the pebbles as it galloped along the beach. Chapter 2. From the dorm room, figures emerged startled from their slumber, rubbing their eyes. In the makeshift cluster of tents, heads appeared from unzipped entrances like meerkats. Everyone stared at each other in surprise, alarmed by the single shot. There had been no bell to warn the inhabitants of an imminent threat. Two men raced towards the stairs to the western end, grabbing boots and clothes as they went. Back on the raised walkway that ran along the battlements, Zed cursed as the figure continued its slow, methodical lurch towards the castle, unharmed and undeterred. Its pace seemed to quicken imperceptibly. The first shot had gone high and right, splintering a rock over the man's shoulder. Zed hurriedly reloaded the rifle. He adjusted his aim slightly to the left to account for the light breeze coming across the bay from the island. Wrapping the rifle strap around his left arm tightly, he steadied the barrel against the raised concrete and fired again. This time the figure's head rocked back violently. The body collapsed onto the shingle, twitching. Those who had ignored the first shot and had passed it off as something else sat bolt upright. Muffled cries of alarm could be heard throughout the castle. Raised voices joined together as people emerged from every door and tent to congregate in the courtyard, pointing towards the suspected source. A single figure was silhouetted on the ramparts. Zed's back was turned. He didn't react to the commotion behind him. Still buttoning his shirt and rubbing the sleep from his eyes, Jack hurried towards the base of the wooden staircase. Zed hadn't moved a muscle. He was still staring down the telescopic sight at the figure lying inert on the shingle. "What the hell's going on?" shouted Jack from below, squinting up at Zed. "Are we under attack?" He was still breathing heavily from his race across the courtyard. A Royal Navy-issue blue sweater with elbow patches had ridden up, exposing a neat pot belly. His thinning hair was wild, his brow furrowed with concern. Zed didn't respond, but muttered something under his breath that Jack didn't catch. The older man took the stairs two at a time, his limbs stiff and sore from yesterday's exertions. The others stepped aside to let their leader pass. He stood panting, fighting to catch his breath. Zed held the rifle hitched on his hip, like a triumphant hunter. Jack snatched the binoculars and slowly scanned the shingle spit before locating the body. Shaking his head, he grabbed the rifle from Zed's grasp and put it back in the storage box. "Why did you have to shoot him? He was unarmed, Zed. We're not animals, you know," asked Jack. Zed stared back at him defiantly. "He was infected." Jack was aware of a gathering crowd watching their exchange, expecting him to act. He looked into the distance and back at Zed. "Every living soul for miles around will have heard that shot." "Shame there's no one left alive to hear it, then," said Zed with a wry smile, unrepentant. Jack laughed, but there was no hint of humour in his demeanour. He was seething, but trying to keep a cool head. "We don't know that. Next time, why don't you hand out invitations? Put up signs?" Jack turned to address the others. How many times have we talked about this? We agreed no guns for a reason, people. We don't want to attract attention. Warning shot only if they don't get the message. If it's only one of them, don't waste the bullet." "Just keeping my eye in. Haven't fired a shot for days," smirked Zed, refusing to back down or admit he was in the wrong. "And there's a damn good reason for that. We don't have ammo to waste, you know that. There are precious few bullets left for that rifle, then what? And congratulations, Zed. You just volunteered yourself to lead today's scavenging party." "Whatever, Jack. Anything to get out of here for a few hours." Zed eyeballed the older man, before wandering off to find something to eat. The first smoke from the canteen drifted towards them. A red-haired woman appeared below, her head part covered with a bandana. Her face pale, drawn and anxious, still buttoning up a man's shirt several sizes too big for her. She raced up the stairs to join Jack and the group on the raised walkway. Passing Zed halfway up the stairs, she paused to stare at him as he brushed past her. She waited for an explanation, but he ignored her puzzled look of reproach. "What was it?" asked Tara, catching her breath, watching Jack peering through his binoculars. "Hard to tell from here," said Jack, squinting, "but looks like an infected. Been a while since one made it all the way out here along the shingle. We saw a few in town yesterday, so maybe one of them followed our trail." "Why did he have to shoot him, for God's sake? Couldn't he have just warned him off? Told him to go away?" said Tara naively. "You really think harsh language would have made him turn around? They don't take no for an answer. Either way, they're dead now. But not before that shot would have drawn every living soul for miles around," lamented Jack. "Or unliving, you mean?" said Tommy, a gangly adolescent standing nearby. Tommy, our resident comedian. Well, perhaps you'd be so kind as to take young Samuel here, roll the cart out and dispose of that body before we sit down for breakfast." "Sure, no problem, Skip," said Tommy with a hint of mockery, punching Sam on the shoulder. "Nice one, dickhead," mumbled Sam under his breath as Tommy brushed past. As the others drifted off to find breakfast, Tara remained behind with Jack, looking back over the camp towards the lighthouse and beyond towards Southampton. In the distance, Fawley Oil Refinery belched smoke hundreds of feet into the air, leaving a grey smear across the morning skyline. A burst pipeline, or perhaps a storage container left to burn, and no one left to put it out. It would burn until the oil ran out. "What we wouldn't give for a few 100 gallons of that oil for the generator," asked Tara quietly. "We drained every garage and farm for miles around, but we'll find more, don't you worry," reassured Jack. His elbows touched Tara's as they both leant over the railing. A comfortable silence passed between them. They watched the camp come to life below them. Hurst's inhabitants busied themselves with washing, preparing food, stitching and sewing, feeding the animals, and generally cleaning up the night before. It was a hive of organised activity. Everyone played their part. Tara turned her head towards Jack and smiled. "You need to get a handle on that Zed. He sets a bad example." "I know, Tara. I'll talk to him, okay? He's never going to change, though, you know that. His heart's in the right place, but he does things his own way. And don't forget, he's one of the best scavengers we've got. I don't want to drive him away. We need him." "He fights for himself, Jack. He'd turn on you in a moment if you got between him and his prize." You're wrong, Tara. His loyalties are very much with us. He's just got a case of cabin fever. Cooped up here for too long, that's all. Will do him good to get out and about." Jack wrinkled his nose, sniffing at the wind. There was something foul in the air, downwind of the latrines. "He thinks we should be doing more to form alliances with the other survivor groups inland from here. That we have our heads in the sand." He shook his head. "I've said it's too dangerous. We don't want to go stirring up a hornet's nest and draw attention to ourselves. He doesn't agree." "You need to keep an eye on him, that's all I'm saying," she said, stroking his arm affectionately. "Same goes for Riley. I don't trust either of them." Jack cleared his throat, intrigued by Tara's views on two of his best. "Don't you worry about Zed. He's just a big kid. His bark's worse than his bite. Reminds me of my lad, Jason. Bless him." There was a distant look in Jack's eyes as he was reminded of his son. He hadn't thought of him in months now. It was just too painful. "He just needs a firm hand and a kick in the backside from time to time." Jack beamed a broad smile and playfully nudged Tara in the ribs. He wandered off to eat, leaving her alone to digest his response. Chapter 3. Out on the shingle, Tommy and Sam pushed the low-slung cart towards the body, a crumpled heap in the distance. The tyres needed some air. Tommy was trying to make light of their task, but Sam was having none of it. "What did you have to go and say that for? I'm stuck here with you, and I could be having breakfast," grumbled Sam. "Oh, quit your whining, will you? It's not like you haven't got me into trouble before." "You're joking, are you? I'm always covering for you," continued Sam. "Anyway, what did Zed have to go and shoot the guy for? What was he going to do, start climbing the walls? This place is a fortress. His date was probably in, he was half dead anyway. On his last legs, if you ask me. Oh, Zed did him a favour, put him out with misery. Saved him a long walk back to whichever hellhole he came from." Sam shook his head. He didn't agree with violence. unless there was no other way. It took both of them to push the cart up the small slope and along the raised shingle roadway that joined Hurst Castle to the mainland. Roadway was perhaps too grand for what it really was. In truth, it was no more than a man-made shingle bank, reinforced with concrete and strengthened periodically to keep out the worst of the weather. Storms had a habit of battering this stretch of the coast, and southwesterly storms had been known to smash a hole and wash away whole sections of the shingle bank, but that hadn't happened for years now. The shingle roadway was wide enough for a Land Rover or four-wheel drive vehicle. In the early days, the roadway had been used to shuttle stores to the castle from local shops before rival groups stripped them bare. It was mostly too dangerous now to ferry supplies by land for fear of ambush. Supplies came by boat from the island or trade with other survivor groups. The network of Solent forts formed part of the wider coastal defences built almost 500 years ago by King Henry VIII to defend the south coast against invasion by the French. Today, those same forts, or at least those modernised and fit for habitation, had formed a loose alliance of sorts to work together where possible. They traded goods and skills, occasionally forming raiding parties to ensure strength in numbers and making scavenging runs into local towns. It was safer that way. Once at the top of the slope, Tommy jumped in the cart for a bumpy ride along the roadway, laughing as they bounced along. Tommy and Sam had known each other since school. They'd grown up together in Milford-on-Sea, shared the same friends, been out with the same girl, Sarah, who worked at the local dairy. Sam had never truly forgiven Tommy for stealing the love of his life, but mates as mates, and their friendship was strong enough to get over that little wrinkle. Tommy's old man had run the local butcher on the high street for 11 years, until he got sick with throat cancer and died the following year. While his mother mourned, Tommy had grown up fast and volunteered to take over the family business, setting aside his aspirations for apprenticeships and further education. It was his way of treasuring the memory of his father. When he closed his eyes, he could still picture him standing behind the counter, striped apron, smiling at customers. The old-fashioned bell that rung when the door was pushed open. Tiled floor covered in sawdust. There were 2 other young lads who'd helped out in busy periods and at the weekends. It was an uneasy relationship at times, what with Tommy being only 19 and the age difference between them no more than a year or 2. Yet Tommy was a fair boss, firm when he needed to be, like when they turned up late or when one wasn't pulling his weight. He always made a point of buying them drinks at the end of the week on a Friday night in their local pub. It's what his father would have wanted. Sam had been a pillar of support when Tommy's dad was enduring the daily torment of chemotherapy, growing weaker by the day. He used to come round with a 4-pack, party bag of Doritos, and play FIFA football on the PlayStation to cheer up his friend. Sam was the strong, silent type, with an intelligent, thoughtful look about him. He was a good and loyal mate. Back then, Tommy still lived at home with his mum. Just the 2 of them once they'd buried his father. She had become withdrawn since her husband's death. It was as if her pilot light had been dimmed by the months of caring, knowing that nothing could save her childhood sweetheart. Still, she went about her daily chores, held down a job in the local chemist's. Her days were lost in reverie. An air of melancholy settled on her every thought and deed. Tommy was the only one who could still make her smile and restore something of her former cheery self. When the Millennial Virus had first struck, his mum was one of the first to fall victim. He suspected the job at the chemist's was to blame, through regular contact with the sick. But in reality, the virus had struck seemingly at random and with the speed of wildfire. It was all over mercifully quickly for his mum. He had taken her into A&E at the hospital, but the place was like a refugee camp. After a cursory look from a distracted nurse, they had sent her home with painkillers to get some sleep. By morning, she was dead. Sam's quick thinking had undoubtedly saved both of their lives. That fateful morning, Tommy had been awoken by a car horn just after dawn, beeping repeatedly outside his house. Staggering downstairs in his dressing gown after a sleepless night, he unlocked the front door, eyes bloodshot, his nose red from blowing, to find his best friend gesticulating wildly and shouting out the half-lowered window for him to get dressed and get out. Sam had seen the morning news and driven straight round. Panic had started. The emergency services were being overrun. Cities were emptying as the sickness spread. Lines of cars blocked exits. A tide of humanity staggered under the weight of its worldly possessions. People carried what they could, impractical valuables soon to be discarded, irrelevant and redundant in a world turned on its head. A litter of suitcases abandoned on the side of the road. Tommy had packed a rucksack in 2 minutes flat with some clothes, a torch, food and water. They had driven to the seafront and sat there staring out to sea, running through their options, Where could they go? Where was safe? In the end, they drove back to the house, locked the door, and perched nervously on the edge of the sofa, watching BBC News 24. Clutching at a can of lager at 10 in the morning, Tommy kept repeating, "No way," in disbelief every 2 minutes, to the annoyance of his friend. They had watched with increasing alarm, batting theories around about Ebola or bird flu. Whatever it was, it looked really bad. The authorities were doing their best to contain the outbreak, telling people to stay indoors, avoid contact with others, they said. A succession of health experts argued about cause and origin. Some said it was a strain of avian flu. Others said it was like nothing they'd ever seen before. A designer virus, maybe. A new kind of terrorist attack, perhaps. In truth, no one knew. There was no vaccine, no cure. Things happened so fast. Sam and Tommy reached the body on the shingle beach. The man was probably in his 30s, lying awkwardly, his leg at an unnatural angle. But what was most disturbing was his face. His lower jaw hung loose, one side blown away. The back of his head a mess where the bullet had exited. His eyes open, staring lifelessly skywards, were flecked with blood and a pale yellow like someone who hadn't slept for days. The sickness was etched into his face. The typical grey pallor, sunken eye sockets, dried up traces of blood from his nose and ears. Considering the trauma to the head, there was very little blood visible at all. Sam gagged, his hand covering his mouth, seeing death close up. "You get the head end," said Tommy, barging his friend out of the way. "Ready on 3. 1, 2, 3. Tommy grabbed the man's feet while Sam more cautiously hoisted the man by the sleeves. He was wearing ski gloves, but wanted to avoid touching his skin if he could help it. The body was skeletal thin, yet they had to swing it from side to side with some difficulty to heave it up and onto the trolley for the ride back. As they bumped and bounced along the quarter-mile of shingle road to the back of the castle walls, a leg slid back over the side. The material rode up, exposing 2 inches of skin, blotched and covered in sores. They dumped the body on the ground again, next to a pit some 30 feet across and 10 deep. They rolled the man over the edge, sliding down to join the other human shapes at the bottom. Tommy grabbed a jerry can and poured petrol into the pit, dousing the bodies, splashing indiscriminately. He struck a small flare and threw it down onto the funeral pyre. They both stood there impassively watching the blaze, enjoying the warmth on their legs and bare arms. Chapter 4. Jack strode back through the main castle gate next to the guardhouse. He stepped over the narrow-gauge rail tracks and crossed a weathered patch of grass. The tracks had been laid in Napoleonic times to deliver stores to the castle from a military dock and landing area, long since dismantled. He continued to the old white lighthouse, set apart from the eastern end of the castle fortifications. The lighthouse was modest but comfortable. There he lived a simple, almost monastic existence that imitated his former life aboard merchant ships. After the hustle and bustle of the castle camp, the silence and solitude were a welcome relief. Many of the rooms were unfurnished, filled with salvaged equipment and gardening tools. The views across the Solent stretched uninterrupted in multiple directions. Jack paused at the doorway, a puzzled expression etched on his face. He noticed the tide slowly rising to cover the salt marshes and sheltered estuary towards Keyhaven and Lymington beyond. Something about the smell of the place reminded him of a former life. He had served in the Royal Fleet Auxiliary for 25 years before using his pension to buy his very own fishing boat, the Nipper. The modest vessel had become his pride and joy, not to mention his livelihood. He had skippered the boat for the last few years, sometimes on his own, but mostly with a deckhand. He knew these waters well, every rock, every tidal eddy. The narrow western entrance to the Solent was notorious for its strong tides. The Needles rocks at the tip of the Isle of Wight were a graveyard to dozens of sailing ships and steamers in days gone by. Some of those ships had paid the ultimate price. As the skipper of a small fishing boat, Jack had a profound respect for the sea. A capricious playground for yachtsmen, but a series of calculated risks for fishermen like him, who plied their trade hauling lobster pots in all weathers, day and night. There had been a small but established community of fishermen in Keyhaven and Lymington 5 miles beyond. Jack was well liked and respected, and knew most of the others, though they mostly kept themselves to themselves. They were territorial. They drank in different pubs, fished their own particular sites, each meticulously mapped by GPS above water, and by depth sounder below. The unexpected sight of a sail rounding the headland to the east interrupted Jack's reminiscences. It was a small sailing boat. He estimated it was no more than 30 feet in length. He slid his wire-framed glasses up onto his forehead and peered through his binoculars. On board and hailing him with a slow wave was a man he didn't recognize. There was a small child beside him, wearing a yellow oilskin jacket. He cursed and made a mental note to reprimand whoever was on lookout this morning. There had been no warning of the stranger's approach. The man on the boat looked back at Jack through his own binoculars and raised his hand to wave again. He cupped his hands, shouting as loud as he could. Jack wasn't sure he heard what was said, but it sounded a lot like, "Ahoy there! Hello, hello!" Jack waved back, more through habit than genuine welcome, but did not approach the quay to help, keeping a safe distance. When the sailor had finished mooring up, attaching lines fore and aft, he cupped his hands again and called out in an educated voice, enunciating clearly, as if Jack might not speak English, "Hello there! May we come ashore?" "Stay where you are. Don't come any closer," cautioned Jack, holding both hands up, gesturing him to stop. "Please, we're not sick. Can you at least spare us some food and water? We're willing to trade what little we have. You can moor up and shelter for the night and then be on your way. We might be able to spare you some water and bread, but we've precious little else to offer you, unless you have something to trade. We don't have much food, mostly cans, but we have some flares and rope if that would be of interest. Look, we're both healthy. We've not been in contact with anyone for days. In fact, it's nice to have a conversation with someone for a change. Please, I'm begging you. I'm sorry. We can't take any chances. It's too risky to let you in." There was an uneasy silence as the man on the boat stroked his son's hair and whispered something in his ear. "What are your names?" offered Jack. "I'm Simon, and this is Toby. Good to meet you both. Where have you sailed from?" "Oh, we left Weymouth yesterday. Borrowed this boat, grabbed what we could. I'm no great sailor, but we got this far." Jack stood there, impassively still, his arms crossed. Simon shifted uneasily, racking his brains for another way to convince Jack to take them in. "We're hard workers. We'll do whatever it takes. Please, just give us a chance." Jack looked him up and down and tried to guess what Simon had been before the outbreak. He wore an open-necked striped shirt frayed at the collar and red trousers that bulged slightly at the waist, with heavily worn Nike running shoes. Jack's guess was a city worker, maybe an accountant or solicitor, someone who had never done a real day of work in his life, never felt the sun on his back as he toiled. He embodied everything that Jack despised: blood, privilege, and money. "We don't have much use for lawyers and accountants round here," he taunted playfully. "This is a working community. Do you have any skills? Any trades? Anything useful?" Simon blushed, pushing his glasses up his nose, alert to the edge in Jack's questions. "Actually, if you must know, I was a solicitor, ran my own practice." He smiled defensively. But... He looked like he was searching for something, then erupted enthusiastically. "I know first aid. I grow my own vegetables." His voice trailed off, trying hard to think of something else he could claim to be good at. "We've got a doctor already. Can you cook?" "Yeah, not bad, I get by. My mother was Italian," he said, nodding confidently. "I make a mean spaghetti bolognese, if you can find me the ingredients, that is. Fresh herbs, tomatoes, oregano, mother's secret recipe. I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you." He snorted. "Yeah, I used to make my own pasta. I see you have a greenhouse back there, so I'm thinking you've got quite the setup here. I'm sure you have room for a couple more." "Simon, I'll level with you. We've got a lot of mouths to feed already here, and we're just barely getting by as it is. But if you're not afraid of hard work, can pull your own weight around the place, and do your bit, then maybe." There was a look of desperation about the pair of them that Jack had seen so many times before. The boy looked close to tears. "Look, please," continued Simon, "we'll do anything. Just give us a chance. It's hard out there, just the two of us. The boy needs a proper home. Kids his own age. You have other children here, right?" "Oh, I have children, yeah, lots of children," said Jack with a sigh, remembering why he enjoyed the solitude of the lighthouse. "How were things in Weymouth? Are there many that survived?" Simon stared at the ground, lost in thought for a second, his voice softer. "Not many. We got hit bad, no warning. I lost my wife and daughter early in the outbreak, and Toby and me didn't get sick. We moved around a fair bit from house to house, living off whatever we could find. It was hard, but we survived. We had some close shaves. Things got crazy. Gangs rampaging, looking for food. We hid during the day and moved around at night. Got caught a couple of times. Had all our food stolen. One time they left us for dead. He broke off, remembering the horror. I don't want to live out there. Not anymore. I'm begging you, please. Just give us a chance. Listen, I'll speak to the others, okay? That's the best I can do. There's no promises. Stay here. Consider yourself in quarantine. If you're both fit and healthy with no sign of infection in 48 hours, then we'll talk. In the meantime, keep yourselves to yourselves and don't go wandering around. If you approach the main gate, you'll be shot. Am I clear? If you need anything, shout. My name's Jack. Everyone knows me. It's nice to meet you, Jack. And thank you. Jack turned on his heels, shaking his head. He was getting soft in his old age. Just what they needed. More mouths to feed. More blooming kids.